Welcome to My Psychedelic Roots, a podcast of conversations with people from a broad swath of lived experience to explore their psychedelic beginnings or roots, what led them to start using psychedelics, what those early experiences were like, and how those roots have impacted their life's unfolding. My name is Amy Bartlett, and it is my hope that these stories, generously shared by my guests, offer perspective and insight into the lived reality of psychedelic experiencing. Please feel welcome to subscribe to follow the conversations, and you are always invited to share this episode with others if you feel inspired, to rate the show, or to leave a comment of support. And so, as always, whoever, wherever, or whenever you are, welcome. I'm glad you're here. In this episode, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Kenneth Tupper, a Canadian policy consultant, scholar, and educator who provides guidance on public health and transformative education, with a particular focus on mental health, substance use, and psychedelic research. He is currently an adjunct professor with the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health, and a collaborating scientist with the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research at the University of Victoria. He has previously held leadership roles with the British Columbia Ministry of Health and the BC Centre on Substance Use, and his publications, talks, and advisory work focus on evidence-informed psychedelic policy, education, and responsible clinical innovation across the healthcare system and communities. In our conversation together, Ken takes us through his childhood of embracing science while being surrounded by awe-inspiring nature in the west coast of Canada. He walks us through some of his early experiences with LSD, often with friends, where the seeds were planted for his interest in more fulfilling and nourishing threads in adulthood, including his passion for playing music and caretaking of his body and health. Ken also shares about how his experiences with psychedelics helped shape his academic and professional choices. And we end the conversation talking a bit about what the present and future of Canadian drug policy is grappling with, as we aim to work towards the equitable and sustainable unfolding of the legal and regulatory space in Canada. It was an expansive conversation, spanning mind, body, and spirit, and it was a pleasure to be in conversation with someone who allows space for all three ways of being in such a fulsome, integrated, and abundant way. And so, let's hear more about Ken's psychedelic roots. Ken, welcome.
Hi, Amy.
I'm so excited to have you here today and to hear about your psychedelic roots. You've done such great work and are doing such great work here in Canada in a lot of different aspects within the psychedelic space. And so I'm excited to hear more about where the motivation for that contribution came from. So, as we like to do in these conversations, is to go back into our childhoods a little bit to understand where our connection to this space began. Thinking back to your younger self before psychedelics, what felt true to you as a kid?
I was raised to be a scientist. My grandfather was a scientist. My father taught at a technical institute, and so I was raised to be either a scientist or an engineer. And until my mid-teens, had sort of a sense that science was the royal road to truth. There was, a few loose ends to tie up, but most of what we needed to know about the world was already learned, and science was the way we got there. And that, religion and spirituality was hocus pocus and bunkum, and nothing really to be gained in that sphere. So that was, I would say, that was my worldview for the most part.
What parts of science were interesting to you, or were you encouraged to be interested in? Was it a biological route? Was it physics, chemistry?
I think all of it, just a sense that religion had been, there's stories that are made up that were believed, and science came along to show that it was all mostly false, and that that what was important for the world was learning more through that method, and I was quite confident that that was the case, and I would say I was disabused of that idea by some experiences I had in my mid-teens, and we can get onto that. But I also had I had, I guess, a sort of humanities side. I always loved reading. I loved reading novels of all sorts when I was a kid. I remember the Narnia Chronicles. So this kind of fantasy world stuff was always very absorbing. So I had this other element of interest, but it wasn't sort of, spiritual in terms of religious upbringing.
Yeah. Was there any kind of religious overlay or religious tradition that your family followed? Some families do anyway.
Perfunctorily, I would say. So, went to Sunday school in a Presbyterian church that my mom brought us to, and I think in retrospect, it was because she liked singing in the choir, and I think there was just a sense of kind of a parental duty to expose your kids to that kind of thing. So we'd go and sit in the church basement with an old lady, and I remember clearly, a few times, or at least one time in particular, a beautiful sunny day, and hearing kids outside laughing and playing, and I was in this stuffy church basement with this old lady who was talking about stories from 2,000 years ago that didn't seem to have any bearing, and I thought, if there's really a God, he'd probably be happier that I'm outside playing in the sunshine like those other kids than sitting here listening to this woman drone on.
Honestly.
So when
So
I had the option to stop going to Sunday school, I think probably around age 9 or 10, I stopped.
and then did you spend your Sundays outside? What was your
Oh,
relationship to
yes.
nature as a kid?
So I was raised in the traditional territories of the Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples,
Mm,
a very privileged place to grow up in retrospect. So rainforest, near the
mm,
ocean, near the mountains, so North Vancouver, Deep Cove, North Vancouver. So a lot of playing in the woods and making forts and building dams and a lot of wildlife, and yeah, it was, I say, very privileged.
that's beautiful. You know, in I haven't spent a lot of time in that part of the country, but the time I have spent, wow, nature is so awe-inspiring and so big and so vast. I'm curious, in that context, did you have any experiences growing up of awe or wonder, those feelings of being outside of oneself or part of something bigger?
I mean, I definitely did with the psychedelic experiences I had, and I must have younger, but I just took it for granted, right? I just
Right.
accepted that was, the way things were. Is there's beautiful forests and, beautiful ocean and beautiful mountains, and I was allowed to just go play with my friends and these things. So it was like, I say, no real sort of experiences that sort of took me out in a kind of state of ecstasy or anything like that,
Right.
that I can recall. It was just a general sense of connectedness to I definitely felt connected to all of that.
Mhm. Did you feel safe as a kid?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's lovely.
Although
You're
in retrospect, and this is some more recent experiences and work that I've done, particularly with ibogaine,
Mhm.
have realized, oh, there were small T traumas that, my upbringing en entailed into my adult life that I had continued to need to deal with, and ibogaine was very helpful in that regard in ways that other psychedelics hadn't been, partly because of the intention that I brought to the experience that I did with ibogaine. So that but that's a whole separate story, so th
Did
that's a
you
branch,
feel
not a root.
Yeah. And again, don't have to answer this or not play in the space if that doesn't feel resourcing, but just out of curiosity for myself and potentially so if it's something that you want to share, what did you learn about your childhood through some of those Ibogaine experiences that perhaps
Well,
related to how you show up in these spaces or how you came to psychedelics?
yeah, I mean, with one example, had one experience, it was just last year, and
Mhm.
it was after my mom had passed away. My dad died 20 years ago, and after my mom passed away about a year and a half ago, it led me into some ongoing counseling, just grief support, and sustained that. I'd done a bit before, but never in the sustained way that I did after my mom died, and then had the opportunity to do ibogaine, and fortunate to go down to the Ambio Life Sciences Clinic in
Mm,
Mexico, and had a reflection. I went in with an intentionality to when I was in the ibogaine experience, I was asking ibogaine, "Why didn't I do this sooner?" And ibogaine was like, "No, no, 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 you weren't ready." And partly it was you only after both your parents had died that you could reflect on your childhood and the attachment that you had to your parents and the way that they had attached to their parents, all of which I sort of started to explore that was finally open for me in a way that was tremendously healing and beautiful. And I hadn't gone to those places with other experiences.
yeah. I'm so glad you had the opportunity to get new perspective on where you were from and the relationships that formed the basis.
It
Yeah.
was a gift for sure.
Yeah. Coming back to your childhood a bit, did you grow up in an environment where psychedelics were ever discussed, either positively or negatively, or other drugs or substances that people tend to use?
So there were drugs around, but they weren't understood or talked about as drugs. So it was alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. Not necessarily in that order. I'd say actually. So seeing my father every morning start breakfast, but before breakfast actually, coffee and cigarette before breakfast. But he didn't do drugs. And alcohol was the kind of social lubricant of all family gatherings, dinner parties, everything. It was always present. It wasn't my parents, neither of them sort of drank heavily to the point of like, you know, being problematic, but it was definitely always there. And, that was also not considered to be a drug. And I remember naively thinking up until maybe my early teens that drugs were something bad and illegal that happened in places like New York City or LA, like far away from where drugs were. Not my little world.
Hmm. And so when did they start to become part of your conscious awareness or part of your world?
In high school,
In high
and that
school?
was, basically drinking and smoking pot, just like sort of with friends and, experimenting, but not yet at that point. It was in 10th grade, I was 15, that I had the opportunity to take LSD, and
Mm.
that really sort of shifted my consciousness in a way that I think even as at the time, my friends weren't even necessarily getting from it, or some if they were, we weren't talking about it, but they'd be like, "Let's drop acid and look at the pretty colors and laugh." And I'd be like, "No, let's drop acid and contemplate the entire oneness of the universe and integrated nature of all things." So I felt like I was kinda getting something different. And again, another sort of retrospective idea that I have about that is that we were playing with really powerful tools like they were toys. 'Cause we had no context to understand the tool potential and the power that they had. It was just they were toys. So it was like, playing with knives. It's like, knife in the hands of a skilled surgeon or a master carver, a master chef can do miracles, but a knife in the hands of a kid who thinks it's a toy, dangerous both for the kid and people around them. And I think that's really analogous to how my first experiences were with LSD, but
Mm.
found something of that potential right away and was able to kind of harbor it and, avoid some of the potential risks and pitfalls that could have easily come along with the way we were, the way we were doing it.
Yeah. Maybe could I ask some questions about what led up to that first experience?
Yeah.
Before you first took LSD, did you know anybody who had taken it before? Had you heard stories?
I had a few friends, but my first exposure to the idea of wanting to take it was actually reading a biography of the Beatles. So I was a
Mm.
Beatles fan, and I think I was probably in about 8th or ninth grade. I read a biography and read about their experiences. I think it was particularly George Harrison talked about, his sense of wonder and awe being kindled
Mm.
through LSD. And I remember thinking that sounded interesting.
Mm.
And so I was definitely kind of intrigued. And again, I knew that Beatles' musical output had changed after they started experimenting with LSD. So it was something that I felt had a positive artistic or creative influence on them. And so I was
Mhm.
definitely curious about what the experience might be like for me.
Yeah. So, how did the LSD come into your orbit? Was it through a friend? Was it at a party? Was it yeah.
Yeah, just through high school friends. And somebody
Mm.
had some. I don't remember how we got it, but we decided we'd take it at a friend's house one afternoon, and it was just like it was kind of like magical. Yeah, that sense of kind of wonder and awe of the world just emerged kind of spontaneously, and
Mhm.
everything was suffused with light and sort of
Yeah.
in this kind of spiritual dimension. So that's the other piece, that this kind of sense of a way of understanding the world or the cosmos had kind of opened up that didn't seem commensurate with my previous belief in the, hard sciences is the railroad to truth. There's something, this was a doorway somewhere else. Um,
Yes.
and so that definitely stuck with me.
The people that you were taking it with, was it all your first time, or was it
Uh,
just your first time?
that's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. I think a couple was also their first time, maybe a couple it wasn't.
Mhm.
I remember.
And what was the setting like? Did you feel safe? Were you
Yeah.
nervous? Yeah.
No, it was a friend's home. Their parents, I don't know where the parents were, but they weren't around. There was an older brother who I remember came home and learned that we were on LSD. He knew he'd done it before, so he just kind of laughed and sort of took care of it. Like, made sure that we weren't, like, gonna get ourselves in any trouble. So
That's
it
nice.
felt totally safe, yeah.
That's really cool, and it's nice that you had a impromptu trip sitter
Yeah.
there.
One particular vignette from that experience was I had to go to the bathroom, so I went into their bathroom, and there was this bubble in the linoleum, and I was like, "That's so
Mm.
weird." I see this bubble, and I stepped on it, and it went down and came back up, and I'm like, "Wow." I'm like, I'm perceiving this bubble, and it's, like, so real, and turned out there actually was a bubble in the linoleum, but it just felt like so I thought it was the effects of the drug, but anyway, it was just kind of amusing, but, yeah, that sense of wonder was, like, about everything.
That's amazing. What was the come up like in that first experience? You know, your first time entering into a non-ordinary state of consciousness, presumably. How did that feel to you? Did you feel nervous? Were you watching others? Were you in your own experience, or did you experience it collectively? How was that
It
for
was
you?
definitely it was collective. To be honest, I don't remember the details of that other than there was no fear. It was just kind of it was very
Mm.
different from any other kind of altered state of consciousness I'd experienced. It wasn't what I was expecting, but it was beautiful and magical and just yeah, it was ineffable.
As they often are.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that first experience, it shook some of the foundations around science versus what else might be out there. It sounds like you had a lot of experience of awe and wonder. What are some of the main insights or takeaways that you had from that experience?
Well, so I'm gonna bracket a set of experiences. So there was that first, and then there was a number. And I was very intrigued, and did a number of times more over the next year or two. And another sort of seminal experience I remember having was with a friend who, in our high school class, he was the guitar player. He'd studied guitar and he had an electric guitar. So my father had a guitar in the closet, and he'd played when I was younger, and I'd learned a couple of chords, but I'd never practiced. So was over at this friend's house, and we took acid, we took LSD together, and sat in his room, and he started playing his guitar, and so because it was an electric guitar, his fingers were moving over here, like I was watching, but the sound was coming out through the amplifier over there, and so there's this kind of synesthesia function going on, and we
Right.
sat there, and he was playing like Jimi Hendrix stuff and like classic rock stuff, but he was pretty good. And I remember sitting there thinking, like with my mouth open, just in completely entranced, thinking, I want to do that. I want to be able to do that too. And literally, like, I came down, like, we just had a beautiful, beautiful night and came down, and the next day went home and pulled my dad's guitar out of the closet and started trying to remember the few chords, like a D and a G, and my mom was like, Do you wanna, like, take a few lessons?" I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah." So I took a few lessons, but mostly I actually that friend showed me how to listen to, like, a CD and get in tune and hear what they're playing and teach myself. So that was, some of how he'd learned. And so I started to be able just listening and playing and basically became I didn't become a musician, but music became a major part of my life from then on. Like, I wouldn't say I didn't become a professional musician, I became an amateur musician to a very high level, like, to this day, still play. So I got into Celtic music in my 20s, started studying West African music. I was fortunate to connect with, Alpha Yaya Diallo, Canadian Ghanaian guitar player who taught me, and I went to Guinea and studied percussion and guitar there, got into an Afrofusion dance band. So this huge sort of musical trajectory that was kind of part of my life originated from that one experience that I feel was like a pivotal moment in my life and feel so fortunate. And I'm quite confident that if I hadn't had that evening and if I hadn't, been on LSD, it would have just been, I wish I'd played guitar kind of thing for the rest of
Mm.
my life. Another example like that was a sense of health and physical wellness that came. This is a different experience. Again, growing up in Deep Cove, it was actually the very first mountain bikes came into Vancouver, North Vancouver, in the Deep Cove bike shop, and so I had a mountain bike. But that one night, I took my brother's. He had a French racing bike, like a road bike. Took that out, and we took LSD, and I was riding around on this beautiful French racing bike, and had this sense of like connectedness where the bike and my body were one, and just had this sense of like my body is so important to take care of physically. And it sparked a lifelong sort of passion for staying in exercise and wellness. And so, it didn't turn me into a cyclist long term, but, just a sense of wellness and mind body connection that was a real gift and precipitated again in a very sort of visceral way that one evening.
Oh, it's amazing those early seeds planted and how they've pulled so firmly through the rest of your life.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really
And I
cool.
mean, it wasn't until many years later that I was able to kind of see that through line, but certainly in retrospect, it's like, okay, that's where some of this stuff came from.
Can I ask about the music piece? What about music felt or feels so resonant or so connected or so yours?
Just the sense of connectedness when playing with others, actually, that's where,
Mm.
although for many, especially when I started, it was me, myself, and my guitar in my bedroom. But once I started to start playing with others, and it was actually learning to have rhythm and lock in, because at first I thought rhythm guitar meant just playing chords. I didn't understand there was this whole concept of rhythm behind it, and realizing that if everybody's locked in rhythmically, and that was where African music just kind of takes it all to the next level, being in percussion ensembles with West African stuff, and it's only, I learned later, it's only after you're exposed to it for literally hundreds of hours that you're able to discern some of the subtleties that are going on, the complexity of it all. So that's, yeah, it's just such a rich part of life, and then, of course, it's with psychedelics, music's a important kind of component, and that they fit beautifully together.
Mm. Part of what I'm hearing in how you're describing some of these pieces is, the way you were just describing music and rhythm and how you've come to understand it with such nuance. It feels almost scientific. I don't know, it feels like there's a bit of a merging of science and art that wasn't there for you in your childhood, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say I never lost the kind of scientific
Hmm.
perspective and interest that actually definitely stayed with me, but, I didn't sort of pursue it, for example, academically when I took after a couple of consecutive gap years, went back to college. I took humanities courses. I ended up doing a double major in philosophy and English, and it wasn't real sort of draw for me to be in the sciences, but I became sort of subsequently, and it was sort of always interested in philosophy of science, like where did history, philosophy of science, where did all of this come from?
Hmm.
And sort of
Very
did
interesting.
more of that in my subsequent graduate studies and PhD work.
Yeah. Coming back to some of your first experiences as a teenager, one other thing that I notice in what you're talking about is that you often had, or it sounds like you often had your experiences with others. I'm curious about how you experienced yourself, how you experienced being in communion with others in these experiences. How did you navigate these sort of internal experiences while you were with others in these non-ordinary states?
That's a good question. It was both a sense of bonding and connectedness. It was a group of guy friends that we'd kind of do it together, but also a sense of inward reflection at the same time. So there was this kind of like push and pull of inward and outward simultaneously that, yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't know how to put any words on that other than there was definitely both parts of that. It was communal
Mhm.
on one hand, but also deeply sort of self-oriented in other ways.
Mm. Did you or do you still connect with those friends and talk about what your experiences were like, or did compare notes or have shared experiences that have stayed with you?
A few, but not
Mm,
and not that often, mostly because 'cause I've moved away. I yeah, I don't live close by anymore. But yeah, no, I still see some of those old high school buddies once in a while, and I don't think we specifically reminisce about particular. Yeah, actually, once in a while we do. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely stuck with us, I think.
mm. Did you have a practice of integration or meaning making? Like, it sounds like these
No,
experiences, even as a teenager, were really profound for you. Again, awe and wonder and sort of foundation shaking insights. How did you make meaning, or did you make meaning beyond the experiences themselves?
at the time, I didn't there was no integration support, no concept of integration. As I say, we were playing with these tools like they were toys, right? So it was just the integration that happened, if at all, was just purely accidental. And you say there was nothing sort of concrete in the moment that I recall that, but it's only in retrospect, many, many years later, decades later, sometimes that I'm able to sort of see that throughput and say, okay, there's another sort of piece of the puzzle of how those early formative experiences led to changes in my life or mostly improvements in my life in terms of,
Mm,
I mean, another example, I remember coming home after I think we'd been up all night on LSD, and I came home and went to get some food out of the fridge, and I looked and I saw a bunch of lettuce and some carrots, and I decided to make myself a salad, and it's like, I would never have made myself a salad. I was like, I'd pour a bowl of, like, cereal with some brown sugar and milk or, make a ham sandwich with cheese or something. Like, I was kind of a meat and potatoes kid, but I just decided I wanted a salad, and so I, like, made this I don't know if it was I would call it healthy now, but it was certainly outside of anything that I would typically have chosen. I don't remember why, other than it just that kind of sense of wanting my body wanted something like salad. And in retrospect, it's like, "Okay, that was probably a healthy eating decision at that point."
I mean, that's part of integration, I guess,
Yeah,
is, you know, doing things we're not used to doing and seeing how they feel or following those impulses and being curious about what that feels like and what
yeah,
that tells us about ourselves and the world around us.
yeah.
Doing it even when we're not intending to.
Accidental discovery, yeah.
Yes. What is your relationship like to psychedelics today?
Very seldom,
Mhm,
it's a little bit of microdosing occasionally,
mhm.
other than, I say, last year, an opportunity to do ibogaine. That was probably my biggest recent experience, just partly because life is busy, you know, stepkids, dog, home, family, work and school, like, I'll just there's a lot going on, so I don't have the sort of time and luxury to carve out the space, or I don't take the time and luxury to carve out the space for it as much as I perhaps used to.
How present do your previous journeys, whether back in as a teenager or as an adult, how often do you think about or reference or have space for those previous experiences? And the answer can be not much, but I'm just curious.
Not much overtly, but I think they all stick with me, and, I had
Mm,
many years of drinking ayahuasca in a regular way, and that definitely impacted lots of elements of my life. In fact, I would say it saved my life in retrospect. I had profound insights about my relationship with sugar,
mhm.
in a couple of sort of acutely in a couple of ceremonies where I had this sense of, like, blood sugar dysregulation and insulin dysregulation that was happening in the moment, and my father had died of complications of type 2 diabetes, so I was well aware of
Mm.
what the disease of diabetes was and the symptoms and a sense of, I've got a genetic predisposition to it, but I hadn't made any kind of significant life changes to think about prevention of that. But in a couple of ayahuasca ceremonies, I had this, like, strong sense of dropping blood sugar and panicking, like, clammy, cold hands and feeling like, "Oh, I need to get some fruit or something. I need to get some sugar into my body," and I remember one was pure, like, it was actually terror, thinking I'm going to go into a diabetic coma. Like, and it was, I think in retrospect, it was like a deception, a hallucination, or a kind of lesson that was being taught in a hard way. I don't think it was probably true, but it was a sense of panic and terror. And when I did sort of get somebody gave me blueberries and I felt better, but it led me to reflect on my relationship to sugar and had some insights of like, well, sugar is a white powder that we've taken out of a plant that, you know, in its plant form probably isn't so harmful, but in its white powder form is pretty toxic. And it's like, where have we heard that story before? It's like, and I didn't become kind of so preachy about it other than to realize that my own relationship to sugar is what I needed to change and really shifted my, sugary oriented breakfasts and desserts after meals, tried to cut all of that out. And then that kind of stuck with me for the most part. Having my stepdaughters come into my life about 10 years ago, sugar's more around. I definitely, partook in chocolate and birthday cake once in a while, but never in the way that I had been doing it prior to those experiences.
Mm.
And really have a sense now of learning the sort of keeping up on the science of what's happening with our understanding of metabolic disease and how sugar is probably a major culprit in that. So, that's
Mm.
another example of a big insight that came to me through these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, it really sounds like a lot of your psychedelic experiencing has been resourcing and sort of pointing you towards music or health or, helping you understand how you're moving through the world and could be moving through the world. I don't know. It's really interesting some of the again, thinking about those really clear through lines that you've carried through your life around
Yeah,
some of these messages is really quite
or at
interesting.
least those are the ones that I, think to reflect on and am able to share with you right now. I'm sure there's many others. Trying to think of I mean, the topic of my PhD dissertation was a download in an ayahuasca ceremony one night. So I'd started my PhD in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia, and for the first couple of years, had the intention to do my research on drug education in schools. Like, what do we teach kids about drugs in schools? And I still think that's a fascinating question. I still think we don't have very good answers to it. It's a very complex issue. But there's a whole other podcast to be done on that topic. But it was in an ayahuasca ceremony one night that I had a sort of download of like, no, you're going to do your dissertation on ayahuasca. You're in a sort of unique position. At that time, I was working in the Ministry of Health in Population and Public Health Division in the area of harm reduction and prevention and drug policy, and I knew I'd been connected to the madrina of the Seo de Montreal church
Mhm.
in Montreal, and had heard that she'd put in an application to Health Canada to get a Section 56 exemption. And the insight came to me that that's what I should do my dissertation on. Like, let's look at how public policy is grappling with the ingress of ayahuasca from South America, and how our liberal democratic states like the Canadian government, although I tried to take it internationally, trying to uphold competing principles or interests of human rights, criminal justice, public health, economics, religious freedom, all of these things pulling in a different direction with respect to ayahuasca specifically, this, Amazonian plant teacher or plant medicine or plant sacrament, or again, there's different ways to construct ayahuasca.
Mhm.
How is it that they're government's automatic reflexive response is that this is bad and needs to be punished. People who do this need to be punished. That's the automatic reflective response rooted in our international drug control system and the legal structures of most of the governments that are signatories to the international treaties.
Yes. As you continue to do that work, where do you hope the needle moves, or how do you want drug policy to look like in the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question, especially given the last decade. Until last year, I was working almost exclusively on the overdose or the toxic drug poisoning crisis here in British Columbia, and there's no magic bullet solution, that's for sure. In some ways, we're trying to put the genie back in the bottle. So, a few core principles that I adhere to is that prohibition has been an abysmal failure. I think it was Ethan Nadelman, I heard say this from the Drug Policy Alliance. It's the most egregious failure of public policy since slavery on so
Wow.
many levels. But what do we do instead? That's that's the challenge. So, what are the kind of regulatory levers and ways to establish access and you know not criminalize and punish people? So that's true for all drugs, but for psychedelics specifically, there's again complexities to that question that I've struggled
Mhm.
with a little bit in terms of publishing with some co-authors, some friends of mine, on ways to think about regulating psychedelics from a public health perspective. There's good lessons to be learned from other types of substances that we've learned to live with, like
Mhm.
alcohol, tobacco,
Yeah.
cannabis now,
Mhm.
both of what works and what doesn't work, or the kinds of, I shouldn't say work or not work, it's the kinds of trade-offs that you have to make, between individual liberties or civil liberties and
Yes.
sort of collective wellness. It gets more challenging with, high potency stimulants and some of the, emergent opioid type molecules, fentanyl, carfentanil, nitazines, medetomidine. Like there's this whole witch's brew. And again, that's partly a function of prohibition itself, the iron law of prohibition.
Yeah.
So being known as the more you try to repress and control these things through criminal justice measures, the more you incentivize black market actors in this sort of underground supply chain to create more concentrated, more harmful forms of these things. And that's true with the whole. I mean, I won't go through the list of drugs for which there's evidence of that, but I say there's a direct connection between prohibition of opium and the rise of fentanyl and carfentanil in our drug supply less than 100 or just a little over 100 years ago.
Yeah. It's a really complex landscape to try to navigate. I'm glad that you're one of the people helping us try to navigate it, both because of your mind, but also because of your experience with some of these substances and being resourced to navigate this space in ways that aren't just risk management, but also benefit, with a view to the benefit that they can also provide,
Well,
which
it
I
was
think is
funny. That
really
was
powerful.
the title. One of the first papers I published on ayahuasca was I forget, globalization of ayahuasca, harm reduction or benefit maximization with a question mark.
Mm,
And that was sort of like the flipping the coin of like, can we not just assume that there's only negatives and harms to come from this? But I also want to bring up my early but growing understanding of the need for respecting traditional indigenous knowledge and the kind of sovereignty
mm,
issues around biopiracy and reciprocity and things like Nagoya Protocol, especially with just, a week or 10 days ago, it was, an executive order out of the US on ibogaine or psychedelics, but ibogaine specifically raises a whole lot of questions about, respect for the traditions from which these medicines have been
yes.
harbored and not just kind of follow the old playbook of colonialism. I feel like that's something we need to keep front and center, and it's a challenge. It's for sure a challenge. The forces of gravity are definitely feel like they're moving towards the same old path of large pharma companies, patenting and making lots of money for shareholders and not necessarily extending benefits to the folks who are most need. Ironically, in some cases, the indigenous communities from which these come, or other indigenous communities.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad that you're doing work in this space and that you're fighting for equitable access and safe access and also asking questions about what kinds of access. I really admire the kinds of questions that you're asking and the kind of work that you do. As we're wrapping up our conversation today, Ken, just to tie it back to your childhood, I'm curious, what do you think little Ken would think about how your life has unfolded and the kind of work that you do now?
It's a good question. I'd like to think he'd be proud of me. I don't
Mm,
know. I'll tie back another piece that I mentioned in a few talks that I've given, but I'll mention it here as well. Is that I remember my grandfather, who was also named Kenneth Tupper, so I was named after my grandfather,
mm,
telling me, I think it was about age 10, he told me about a report that had been written by a group called the Club of Rome, called The
Mm,
Limits to Growth, and it
mm,
was an analysis of, the growth-based economic structures that we all take for granted and the planetary limits to the resources, energy, and other material resources that it's all predicated on. And I remember him talking, he told me this is the most important thing that your generation is going to have to deal with. And totally remember that. But then, kind of a number of years later, I think it was in college, learning that that report kind of had gotten discredited, but I'm not quite sure by whom, but I think it was like sort of mainstream economics. It's like, oh no, well, look, we haven't run. This said we're going to run out of all of our resources by 1995, and here we are, and it's totally fine. But I still have this sense of like there's something deeply insightful about that perspective. I mean, it goes back deeper than that. I mean, Thomas Malthus started talking about this kind of stuff a couple hundred years ago, but a sense of the way I see it is a tension between ecology and economy that ultimately should be synonymous. Those two words have the same roots, but we have an economic mindset that's predicated on infinite growth and an ecological reality that is finite. And it's, even I think going to the moon or Mars isn't really going to replace the Earth. So the sort of question that I think is most important for our brightest minds today is to think about how do we create a system of sustainability and reciprocity that is going to bring ecology and economy together. And I fear that our money systems are tied up in that, like sort of the nature of money itself. But I have this hope that somehow psychedelics are going to play a role in
mm,
bringing that kind of thinking to how we can deal with these problems. That's the kind of insights that have in part been sort of catalyzed through my own experiences, and I've heard from others their experience as well. I don't think it's universally true. I don't think everybody has those experiences with psychedelics, but maybe there's going to be enough that we'll start to, I say, put some real thought into new structures and systems.
mm. Well, what a beautiful note to end on, Ken. Such hope, trepidation, but hope.
Thank you.
And again, thank you so much for taking the time to share your story and share your perspective and some of these beautiful through lines from your first experiences that continue to percolate and that we all get to harvest from your contributions to how this space is unfolding and developing and the push for equity and sustainability wrapped up in all of that. It's really powerful and really important. And yeah, I'm very grateful to hear your story and for you to share that.
Well, thanks for creating a platform for me to put it on.
Hmm. Thank you.